Good evening, buenas noches, buenas tardes, welcome. Thank you for joining us in conversations on culture, race, myth, art equals justice. This was a series that was to be actual, and because of COVID-19, we all had to isolate. And what we did was put these conversations online. And I think it's been a plus because the conversation has reached many more people than we would have if it would have been actual. But at the same time, the warmth that we feel from each other, right? And the extra conversations that happen have not been able to happen because we've been online. But one of the things that came up during the conversations, which we didn't expect in terms of work, is that Annie Rivera and Isis Natai, who's not on, who will be on in a future conversation, thought up the idea of developing a survey. Because as we know, based on being leaders of our institutions, participants in our community, activists in working on different issues within our communities, we know the reality, but too often the data is missing. And when the data is present, it's viewed from an outsider's point of view. And not only from an outsider's point of view, but it's seen through lenses that do not respect our culture, do not respect our legacy, our intelligence, our brilliance, and frames things in a deficit model as opposed to the model that says that we have survived, we have continued to grow, we have continued to thrive in spite of all of the obstacles that have been put before us. And that was actually the genesis of these conversations when we saw in the past, before this administration, right? We saw the dismantling of institutions that we had fought to sustain and maintain, both on the ground, on the local level, and also at the national level. So that these conversations became the imperative because we wanted to talk to each other in terms of what we were seeing, and at the next level, what we were to do about what was happening. And what we are to do now, as we see the continued confrontation, right? And verbiage from a white supremacist point of view that continues to undermine the value of culture, the value of intelligence, the value of truth-telling in our educational systems and in our cultural sphere. So we welcome you and we thank you for being with us. And I'd like to address the format that we will be looking at. There is a survey that has just come out yesterday. And as I said, Annie and Ishe were the ones that drove it. Neida came in on it. Neida Martinez came in on it, helped us put it together because we're so creative that when we think of something, everybody jumps in and helps, right? So that this survey came in and the questions came in before Nikisha joined us. And thanks to Amy and Melody, I met Nikisha, who then told us, I'm in and I'm gonna help you put this together, and I'm in for the long term. So even before we start, I thank Nikisha for being so brave and loving us so. So I'd like to introduce you to Nikisha through her bio and why we're so excited that she's with us. And she will present the survey. And then our facilitators, the people who you're seeing on your screen, will be introduced by Annie and I. And then we will enter a conversation. And we hope that our audience that is joining us will enter the conversation as well. So Nikisha Hamilton is CEO and founder of Afeni Creative Studios, a policy and community advocate, writer, and creative with a professional background in government and community engagement. As founder and CEO of Afeni Creative Studios, Nikisha utilizes policy and community skills to design new political and governing frameworks for a more inclusive, global creative economy. Nikisha earned her Bachelor's of Art, focused in global and comparative Governance from American University, along with 2 fellowships, Public Policy International Affairs from Princeton University and NYU Urban Fellows. With a demonstrated history of working in public service, Nikisha worked within the U.S. Attorney's Office, U.S. House of Representatives, New York City Mayor's Community Affairs Unit Office, and the Domestic Policy Council's Office of Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity at the Obama White House. Nikisha lived in 2 countries and traveled to 19 countries in Europe to study the European Union, economics, governance, security, and culture, which taught her what is possible for the African diaspora. After Nikisha worked at the Brooklyn Museum as the head of government and community relations and serving as board member and teacher for Movement Black Youth Abroad, Nikisha understands that art and culture are critical components for Black people's soft power and liberation. She was the data working group leader for culture at 3 and realized that organizations of color lacked the support needed through data, policy, and funding. This is why it is important for her to harness and protect the African diaspora's access to the creative economy. Currently, Nikisha is serving as a consulting campaign manager through Afeni Creative Studios in Brooklyn for City Council District 40, which consists of the following neighborhoods: Prospect, Lefferts, Garden, Flatbush, East Flatbush, Demise Park, Kingston, and Crown Heights. She is also working with some arts and cultural organizations through New York City and the Creative Justice Initiative as a new baby in our midst. So thank you, Nikisha, and you're on.
Hi, everybody. Very, very honored to be a part of such amazing, incredible people. I've learned so much with you all. So I'm very grateful to have done this survey analysis and to be here to share our findings with you all because, you know, as Dr. Vega said earlier, data is very important. And I think that what I've learned from all of these people on the panels and other arts and cultural leaders that serve communities that look like me, mainly I'm talking about Black people, for myself. But what I learned from them is that you guys been saying this story that has not been collected through data. And so this data that we're going to view and going to look at it's data that kind of it reinforces your advocacy efforts, your what people have been saying for years and years. And so now we have this tool, and so we need to continue utilizing this tool. So I'm going to break it down for you, and I'm ready to go. So go ahead, Olga. Let's do this.
So
Olga,
go ahead.
Yeah. So as we know on page 6. I think approximately 571 organizations, well, 557, pardon me, organizations submitted, filled out the survey, but only 213 people completed the survey. And that is very important to note because we have the numbers, we have the people who are ready to fill this out, but completing the survey gives us a better view of the data and gives us much more rich data. So next time the survey comes around, you know what to do, complete it. The large amount of the respondents are located in the Northeast region of the United States of America. However, people from all over the US, you know, Northeast, Midwest, West, and South, including the US territories, such as, I think on the next page, such as Puerto Rico, US Virgin Islands, the American Samoa, and Guam. What most of the organizations that completed this survey, 83% of them were nonprofit organizations and 17% were for-profit organizations. So that also may play a role in how we think about this data and how people later on, when we talk about funding sources and support and resources, that the differences among organizations are there based upon their structure, whether it is their nonprofit or they are for profit. Most of the organizations identify themselves as multifunctioning, which is no surprise, right? What we mean by multifunctioning is that they're visual and performing arts and cultural organizations that serve their community in different ways, making sure that they have programs to really connect with community members. So that shows that they have to have a wide range of access to resources, or a wide range of resources to have diverse type of programs to connect with the communities that they serve. Next slide, please. Again, one of the notes that I thought that I learned after I analyzed this data through, hello, Dudley. Dudley brought up a point that since a large amount of the data that's concentrated in the Northeast region, when we look at the average median income of the audience members, even though through this survey, the average audience member median income was $43,377. I learned that that is not the case in other aspects of the US. That is actually on the higher end for a lot of audience members that various organizations serve. That income is on the higher end versus versus other organizations that may serve people who have an average in their area. Their average median income could be $15,000 or $20,000, which is what I saw in other when I looked at individual data points for each organization. That's some of the numbers that I saw in different regions. As a native New Yorker, I thought that this data point was very fascinating, and I still can't let it go. It's in my mind constantly. The fact that a majority of our organizations across the US and US territories, they rent their space. So 74% of the organizations rent their space versus 26% who own their space. And as people who may serve or interact with communities that experience marginalization, I think it's very interesting when we come into the conversation about property and ownership and how important it is to have ownership. And so within that question, or within the property ownership and rental discussion piece on the survey, surprisingly, many organizations, I think about 64% of the organizations, did not think that market forces play a role or gentrification play a role in the displacement of organizations. And I'm excited to delve deeper into that point. Because speculative market in the capitalistic society, speculation plays a role in raising prices in local neighborhoods, which precipitate displacement. So it's really interesting that a large amount of organizations did not see that connection, and that's just my own personal analysis, of course. 94% of the organizations are functioning online given COVID, but only 73% said that they have the expertise that's necessary to make sure that programs function online, which to me spells out that a lot of organizations may need additional resources and support in order for them to better utilize the virtual space. And also when I analyze this data, what that also shows to me is that we are very resilient folks and very tactile in the sense that we're agile, this is a better word. We pivot, we adjust to serve the community that we serve. But going to the virtual space means that we had a loss of audience members. And so before COVID-19, many organizations together on average had about 1 million, they serve 1 million audience members, about approximately 1 million audience members. Since COVID happened, that went down to 62,000, which is a steep decline in audience engagement. And as you may know, audience engagement is not just engaging people, doing programs for them. That can also be a source of income for many organizations. So if they've lost their audience members, that is a source of income that they may have lost as well. I think on the next point, which we'll talk about structure of annual operating budget and funding model, this was very fascinating because when we think about sustainability and growth of organizations, you have to think about budget and the type of budgets that they have in order to ensure that their organizations are functioning the way that they need to, and they're engaging the type of audience members that they need to. 51% of the organizations that filled out this survey have an operating budget of $250,000 or less, and only 6% have over $1 million or $3 million for their operating budget. And what we see is most organizations may have in between 250,000 and 2 million or almost 3 million. So this was on a more personal for myself. This was pretty shocking for me because I've done data for New York City arts and culture as a whole, and for the CI and for the Cultural Institutions Group. And I have seen organizations that had small operating small operating budgets, but to know that our organizations are nowhere close to larger organizations' operating budget, but what definitely punch above their weight all the time, reads to me that this may or may not be sustainable for organizations. And another question that came to my mind as I was analyzing the results is how will these organizations grow their operating budgets given the impact of COVID-19? So most of the organizations receive about I would say 60 to 98% of their funding from government. And many of the other organizations definitely receive receive like at least 0% of their operating budget from government. So it's either I'm very supported by government or I'm not supported at all. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at government loss, when we're looking at philanthropy, 30% of organizations have their annual budget coming from philanthropy. So what does that mean? If we look at a pie, if we look at 100% of the pie of an organization's operating budget, 30% of that pie comes from philanthropy, which is a good chunk of your operating budget. And what's interesting, what I learned in interacting with cultural leaders a part of this panel, is that if you have most of your organization's operating budget reliant on philanthropy, like 30%, you may be applying to a foundation that has restrictive guidelines or strict guidelines that you have to abide by in order to attain that funding. And if that funding is not diversified, if the foundation doesn't change up that rule, then those rules of the funding or whatever funding that you may be reliant upon, then you are not able to be free to diversify your other forms of programming. So if you're funding, for example, I can only think of the New York City CASA grant. If New York City doesn't change the CASA grant, and you're supposed to have the same program in order to get the same funding next FY or next fiscal year, then that means that there's no, you're stuck as an organization in some aspects, at least programmatically. over 50% of the organizations received 10% or less of discretionary funding. So discretionary funding means different things in different areas. At least for us in New York City, discretionary funding means that this is funding that you have flexibility to utilize for any almost anything that you need to utilize it for. So that was a very interesting data point for us, because that means that you are in a box in some sense, right? That your operating budget may be 30% or more, or maybe 100% reliant on foundation funding. However, you may be restricted by the guidelines that they provide, which means that you can't grow your organization in the way that you want to programmatically or operationally. And you don't have as much access to funding where there is some sort of flexibility, where there is some sort of discretionary, where you can decide how you want to use that money. Another thing that I found very interesting was that many folks may appropriate no more than 10% of their operation budget or operating budget to administration. And I think that's something key that we can easily gloss over. But why that's so important to me in my mind is that if you don't have the staff to complete government funding application, foundation application, or even to just do administrative tasks for your organization to function, then you're not able to grow the organization in the way that you want to. You don't have someone on staff to do the research to find additional funding. You do not have the staff to make sure that the details are counted and there. So I thought that was very fascinating, and us transitioning into staff and organization support for operation. No surprise, many organizations lost a large amount of staff. We're talking about, when we're talking about the survey, from folks had at least on average probably 1,500 full-time staff members. What was interesting, before COVID, they had a lot of aggregately, a lot of the organizations had, I think on average, 1,839 contractors, which is more than the full-time staff that they had. So that means to me that organizations are able to contract people for a certain amount of time because they're not able to have them full-time on their staff, which means that there's no there's no way that we can have a continuing support or growth, or even staff who may have institutional knowledge to help think about how we can advance the organization to the next level. So I thought, so those are some of the things that we thought that was interesting. And more than 86% of the respondents anticipate a shortfall in funding due to COVID-19. So this means that they're not able to rebuild their team and develop and execute ideas and programs that they may have had in plan for 5 years or 2 years, or wanted to do it before COVID happened. But now they may be experiencing a deficit and could be anticipating even more of a shortfall because no one expected COVID, of course. 51% of the organizations are reliant on board, volunteers, and the community to increase their contributions to ensure that they survive through the crisis. And I think that that's important to note, because if your board reduces in size in the middle of COVID and you're reliant on that extra board member to donate money, or if you live in a community that is great, have a great volunteer base, but they don't have they don't have the income that can help them donate to you, then we don't know what will happen there. But it's good that the organizations, at least 51% of the organizations do feel that they have the support of the communities of their own communities. However, 33% believe that they will get contributions through pro bono or in-kind services. and 49% of these respondents who believe that they will not receive any increased support from their own community. So there is a wide range. We are all in different places in our functioning as organizations due to inconsistency and funding, or inconsistency in having the staff that they need to have, which is not good. And I know that's something that we're going to delve deeper into later on as well. Next slide too, Olga, please. So what we have is that what was most interesting is that 63% of the organizations experienced at least 20 to 100% of funding loss from the government. 66 experienced, and that was in FY 21, fiscal year 21. So we're talking about maybe right after COVID-19 happened, or of course during. There was a slight increase where there was 66 organizations experienced 20% to 100% of loss in funding in government in the fiscal year 2022 or 22. However, all 100% of the respondents did experience government loss, government funding cut. And if we think about earlier when I discussed that, at least with philanthropy, if we look at the pie again, 30% of your funding comes from philanthropy, and also probably 30% or more comes from government. So the fact that many of those organizations are experiencing 20% to 100% loss in funding from the government, that means that when we're looking at their operating budget and we're looking at the pie, when we're looking at that 20% pie, that's 20% that is missing, that you were dependent on the government for, and now that's gone. And if you were 100% dependent on the government, how are you going to function? How is your organization going to operate? So that means that there's a piece of the pie that's not going to be filled, or you're going to have to wait to fill, and your organization may not be able to sustain itself until you get funding restored. For the philanthropic funding, 19% of the organizations did not receive any funding during COVID. 43% experienced 20 to 100% loss in philanthropic funding, which again, I want you guys to visualize this pie. So if you experience 20 to 100% loss in funding for your operating budget, that means that that's a slice of the pie that you're not going to be getting, because you can't get it from government to subsidize the loss that you got from philanthropy, and you can't use philanthropy to subsidize the loss that you got from government, because their funding may be two different things. So how can organizations sustain themselves when they have, when a large amount of these respondents rely heavily on philanthropy to fund their programs, their operations, and of course support their community members? So that's a huge issue that we talked about as a group. 17% did not receive any funding from philanthropy community. And most of these organizations have experienced at least a 15% loss, if not all of them experienced a 15% loss in funding in FY 21, fiscal year 21, and fiscal year 22. Finally, I think this was the saddest part of the analysis. Next slide. Because 91% of the respondents expressed that they anticipate permanently closing their institution. Most, if not most, of the organizations believe that if they do not get the funding that they need, They will definitely, they can't bring on back their staff. They definitely will have to permanently close, or they will not be able to get back on track on their 5-year sustainability plan or their 10-year sustainability plan. Many folks expressed that they described their prospects as hopeless and dim. Many of, at least 37 of the organizations, indicated that their future is unknown, and they used language such as skeptical and concerned. And only a small percentage, a small amount, approximately 12 organizations, said that they are optimistic. But that is, again, a small amount of organizations that express that they're optimistic on getting back on track when it comes to their organizations. So for me, on a more personal note, when I got to that part of the survey, I thought I was not surprised, because when I was looking at the numbers for government and philanthropy, and when I was talking about, as I expressed to you guys, looking at the pie, I did not understand how organizations could flourish or could grow when they will be experiencing such devastating loss. Because if you are anticipating 20% loss in philanthropy and 20% loss in government, that means that's 40% of your funding that has disappeared. And then when we talk about audience membership, that's increased, and you may have had paid programming, but because we want to support our organization, many of the paid programs became free programs because we want to support our communities through tough times. That's paid operations that disappears now, that you don't have access to. So that may be 15% of your budget. So you can be experiencing from 40 to 80% of your budgets disappearing. And that's why a lot of the organizations believe that they will be closed permanently, or will not be able to get back to the way that they used to operate prior to COVID-19. And I think in a larger sense, we can of course open up to questions, and I can delve deeper into various aspects that I talked through the survey. But to me, what that says to me when it comes to the survey, and one of the things that I got really tired of is hearing people say, and it's true, but it was a running line, COVID-19 exacerbated issues that already existed. And what this shows to me, because as an analyst, you have to be very neutral. So I'm speaking as Nikisha right now. But what that shows to me is that we have a dependency problem among our organizations. And we're dependent on funding that comes around yearly or annually or every other 6 months. We're dependent on the government to make sure that we are a budget item in whatever budget they pass on the local to the federal level. And so what happens when we are not a priority, especially since we've never been a priority because we have not been able to get funding that is having annual funding disallows you from doing 5-year planning, 10-year planning. So you're restricted to how your organizations will grow because you are dependent on paycheck to paycheck, or from foundations or from government. So I think that this opens a larger conversation on not only the problems that we found ourselves in and that we're currently in, but how are we going to get out of it? How are we going to get the support that's needed? And this is why this data is important, because we can utilize this data to do government advocacy, to do advocacy with our philanthropic partners and community, because we have the numbers that have been backing everything that folks have said prior to having this data. And so I think that the next time we see a survey that we make, as our people, us make, it's important that we invest in that survey and we take time, because I understand that people definitely went through survey fatigue. But for us to have more arsenal in this, what it feels like to me, some sort of war in some sense, right? We need to have numbers to back it up. So that's my plea to you. If you see if you see a survey from, maybe the Creative Justice Initiative, complete it, because this can be a great resource for us all and how we think about growing all of our institutions moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikisha. Thank you so much. I'd like to go to Annie, who was, for a moment, who was one of the instigators in our discussions and our organizing the conference that came up with the idea of doing a survey. So Annie, does the survey begin to address what your concerns were, is my question?
I think that yes, to some degree, it's what Nikisha mentioned, is like we've known this information, and to see the data, we know that historically, I'll speak from the small organization perspective, we've been historically disinvested in. I think that when we were asking these questions, we were right in the middle of still in COVID response. And while many of our organizations are arts and culture based, we became first responders. And that was really the need that was driving this, because we understood that the playing field had been frozen. I mean, what I mean by that is all the funding sources had frozen. Government was trying to sort of understand where we were going. Philanthropy cut a lot of arts, particularly arts funding, was really stagnant. And we had to still serve communities. So we were trying to understand what was we already knew how we were systemically operating, and that we've always been sort of on our knees operating, penny pinching, as I was mentioned earlier. But we understood that with COVID, there was going to be a new way and a whole shift. And I think this is important to see the data centralized in one place, to also advocate that, the idea that the loss of employment that we see in numbers, that we lost more than half of our staff, the idea that we lost so much funding, that 91% of our arts organizations don't see themselves coming back. It's a moment for all city, philanthropy, all parties to get together and really think about what is it going to take to invest and to make sure that our cultural hubs and our artists are part of the solution. In many of our histories, we know that artists are the first responders that are, making our neighborhoods safer, making projects that reflect who we are, and yet they're the last ones to be invested in. And I thought that 91% was really frightening, because that has been, the story of many of our institutions, especially the ones that are getting to this very seasoned, sort of 50 years plus. That do not own their spaces. And we've known this has been an issue. So COVID shut down, it not only shut down our cultural hubs, it shut down businesses that were reflective of our culture, that are servicing our community. And now when we're coming back, we're seeing the investment go to economic development, and yet the arts are still once again not in front. So that 91% to me is like, I just want to kind of like go with my flag and fly it all over the country and say, this is a crisis. And we are going to, this is also part of the larger attack. It's not just, it's like attack on using a colonial framework to keep us down, because we're forced to shut down and to still do the work. And so I think it's really important. I'm really interested in the data. I find it that 30%, the fact that the cities, our government, local government is only funding 30% of our organization's operations, and they're project-based, not general op-based. And we have been key recovery partners. It's a shame. It's a shame, and we have to hold our cities and our elected officials accountable to this, because we have been there. We are the reason why there's solutions in our cities to COVID-19, and yet very few are moving behind slowly because of policy. And I think that's something we should also be looking at in our next survey, is what is the role and how do we engage in policy advocacy? We've had a huge learning curve locally, I'll speak from San Francisco's perspective, to really partner with the city beyond just saying, we're going to keep organizations whole. It's like, no, we're going to really serve. And I started addressing the recovery needs from our local community, and making sure that arts and culture was included was a #1 priority for the Latinx community in our latest budget advocacy, which we see it as a win. But we see it as an opportunity to also hold philanthropy accountable, because we have not heard from philanthropy. We're still in these conversations.
These moments to advocate
Absolutely.
in terms of the numbers and what's missing and who needs to step up. Dudley, sort of looking at what we went through during the Reagan era and what we went through the previous administration, and what that has done in terms of our institutions, our communities, right? The artist's voice. What comparisons do you see? What changes do you see? What does the data speak to that we need to do?
So for me, the data tells a ongoing story. And I think pretty much everybody on this panel has agreed over the course of all these conversations that, there was a real bad turn in 1981 when the Reagan administration mandated a policy of trickle down. And trickle down economics has made the rich richer and the poor poorer. There's just all the data would show that. And the trickle down mandate was an intentional strategy, and it continues to be. So I think what we're looking at is now a 40-year struggle and a 40-year reign of trickle down, devastating our communities. And it didn't always used to be as severe as it became when Reagan came in, and then everybody followed suit from Reagan. So for example, during the Carter administration, they had a very successful project called the Neighborhood Self-Help Project. And the premise of that project was that people in communities know how to solve their own problems often, but they're seldom given the resources to do so. So they do the best they can, but they've been starved for resources for these past 40 years. So I see it as, part of this ongoing struggle. Over the course of 40 years, I've seen so many tender shoots put up and then mowed down, put up and mowed down. And so it is somewhat emotional to see that right now, 40 years later, the same thing going on. But that's the struggle, and we don't have any option but to keep on pushing.
So let me go to Amy and Melody, right, who were on the panel, who sort of organized the panel discussing the stability of small organizations, right? Organizations that are grounded in community, that are servicing our community, that are focused on our legacy, our history and culture. How does this data influence and impact, right? What you're developing in terms of your institutions?
Do you want to go first, Melody?
Doesn't matter.
Well, for me, I think I'm more concerned with, I think we can all agree that over the last 16 months, there's been a lot of coalition building and conversation around these topics. I hate to say it really simply, but I'm ready for action. I think we've learned a lot. I think this report is phenomenal in giving us the data and the metrics to move forward. So now what do we do? Now that we have this information, right?
That's Nikisha, she's our guy.
Right, Nikisha, what do we do next? Now that we have this information and we can advocate for ourselves in the way that we need to, in multiple ways, actually, what are we doing? How are we building that sustainability plan so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there isn't 91% of these organizations who are seeing the threat of closing as a reality for themselves, or that what was it, 74% of us that are, was it 74% that are
Renters?
that are renters? How do we find a way to build, how do we build a sustainability plan where we're acquiring land and property, you know, that creates equity for our organizations? You know, I'm over this fiscal year to fiscal year situation. Like, how do we, you know, going back to thinking about, what was it again? What was the name of the organization? Villages of Humanities and Arts in Philadelphia with the 100-year plan. How do we create a program like that where we're all kind of feeding into or buying into in some way, shape, or form? How do we invest in ourselves and force their hands? That's how I'm kind of looking at it and trying to study the landscape. And I think this is the kind of data we need to do that work, to push not just you know, private foundations or major donors, but to push city government, et cetera, to think beyond just the arts organizations. How do we create basic income for our artists? How do we create healthcare systems for our artists? How do we go beyond just the traditional models of, I need X and X dollars for this program? So that's where I'm at, emotionally, mentally, I'm trying to put it together and recalibrate in some way.
I think that what we learned from our panel were several things. And historically, because I've been in this so long with kind of my mentor, fearless leader, Marta, is that philanthropy at all levels, public and private philanthropy, has been designed to keep us small.
Ooh, girl. Yeah.
This notion of like, we're in crisis because of COVID is crap. We've always been in this crisis mode. I don't think there's any room to excuse anybody, any agency, any sector from investing in our organizations, government, and the fact that, you know, the report shows, and Nikisha stated, the large dependency on government, it's our money. These are our tax dollars. So yeah, it could be a large chunk of what's supporting our organizations, because without it, it's taxation without representation. So the public sector money at both the city, state, and federal level has to be there. The private sector, as we saw this year, is able to bend the rules. The private sector is able to break the rules, not just bend them, but break them. What we saw happen in the emergency mode was that they were able to tap more of their endowment to make money available to organizations in this crisis. And yet, as we look at the way funding is coming now, as we're looking at the next round of funding, everybody's gone back to business as usual.
Yep.
The emergency mode of COVID, we were all told that we could make our grants, or most of us anyway, most of our grants became unrestricted. General operating, which is a funny term because it still was general operating with restrictions, because they still wanted to know how you spent the money.
Exactly, right. Those reports always come.
Really a general operating grant, but okay, right? So the restricted grants all of a sudden became unrestricted. So there's that. There is the issue of ownership. I mean, the center is very fortunate in that we own our space on 125th Street. We have partners, community partners, who are saying, can we negotiate having a desk and a phone in your space so we have an address?
Right.
Right?
That's right.
We're now looking at what does our footprint look like in El Barrio, where the center is based. Right. How do we expand our footprint as developers are coming in and bulldozers? Right? And negotiating with developers who, you know, we've got to look at both sides. Are we sellouts because we decide to work with a developer and get a space? Or do we let them come in and then have nothing? Right? So looking at how we expand our footprint, looking at how we expand collaborations, looking at how we serve community in the true spirit of serving community is a concern. Amy's looking at expansion of space. We're looking at expansion of space. We're in a situation as the Caribbean Cultural Center with, once again this year, after like 20 years, we've had the discussions around whether or not the center may be considered or designated a cultural institutions group, what they call CIGs in New York City, of which there are only 35 organizations, 35 cultural organizations that get 85% of the city's cultural dollars. Y'all dig that? 35 organizations are getting 85% of the cultural dollars, before the rest of us, over 1,200 program groups, share 15%.
Of program monies.
A program,
15%,
that's not general operating.
Yeah, 15%, which is program money, 15% that we have to submit an application for every year, 15% that gets split with 1,200 groups that go through a panel review process.
Competitive panel review
That is
process.
competitive. The 85% that goes to the 35 is baseline funding, y'all.
More trickle down.
Now,
Exactly.
at the point where we might be considered for that,
It sounds like the upper 98% to me.
what happens for an organization like the center to be considered to be a CIG? We have to give up our building back to the city.
What?
Mm.
That's one of the conditions.
No.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Right?
I tell you, it's a colonial framework keeping us from creating equity and access for our community. Oh my
So when you
goodness.
talk about these
But-
35 groups, understand that of the 35, there are only 3 of color, maybe 4,
If that.
that have made the CIG, that all get less than $1 million, because you've got the Met and the Natural History and the Lincoln Center, and even the zoos and the botanical gardens rate better.
So Melody brings a very important point, and I come back to you, Melody, but I want to go to Nikisha when this point that you're making. Olga was supposed to moderate this discussion, but I remember that the funders panel, remember we had a funders panel that Olga Garay moderated, and in one of the conversations, Leticia Peguero came out with the idea. She says, well, large institutions get blanket funding. They're blanketed in. It's not like they're asked to every year submit a proposal in CIGs, right? This is basically what you're saying. They have a blanket that they get all this money. They're guaranteed this money over time, right? All they have to do is be.
Does it exist?
Right? So that in reality, we don't have any blanket type of funding. So Nikisha, you have worked with both groups. So how do you see this blanket type of protective funding that goes to large institutions, right? Which is what Melody is describing. How then do we translate that into a framework that, in a sense, you know, and let's face it, doesn't make you a sellout, because we don't want to be sellouts to our own community and joining a process that's colonial, right? And exclusionary, right? Of other groups. So how then do we frame, and Amy and Melody, you all were working on it on your panel, how do we develop that different framework and that different structure?
I think
we lobby for and we campaign for, right?
Exactly.
Well, I think for myself, I've definitely seen, because I was the head of government community relations, so I've definitely seen, and on my own have gotten millions of dollars for the for cultural institutions and for cultural institutions. And just how, I think even how our structure, our own organization structure versus the cultural institutions group, organizations such as those, they can afford a government community person to go and get at least $4 million, $5 million every FY for operations, for expanding space and what have you. The fact that I don't have to worry about money for rent is something, especially in an area that, in New York City in particular, where, you know, the prices keeps on going up and up. And I talked about the speculative market. So like for my own vision, own dream is that we have to, and this is going to be answering a bit of Irene's question, what do we think about are the best ways to address these funding losses? We have, well, as a collective, as a coalition, we will have to attack the federal level. We have to get laws in place. We have to strengthen our arts caucus. We have to make sure that we are advocating on the federal level to get specific types of policies implemented in place, because once the money leaves the federal government, then it comes to our state. So we have to attack the system on 3 different levels, because once it leaves the federal government, it comes to the state. And if you're trying to ingrain yourself, for instance, in a school curriculum, the state has control over that school curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
The state has control over the education system of your local of your local schools or what have you. So we have to find ways to get arts and culture ingrained in every single budget and whatever commission, whatever department of or local department that you can, so that we cannot be easily erased from different budgets or different levels of government.
Yeah, but I guess Melody's point is that that's already happened, right? There's money, 86%. Let's just take New York City. 86% of the dollars, government dollars, go to 33 organizations. That reality is there. That
Right.
reality, no one, when I was directing, ever showed me a policy or a legal piece of paper that said that these 33 organizations were privy to this money. And they were privy to free space, right? Because all of them don't have to pay rent. Our institutions are paying rent, right? So that there's already a structure. And how does one impact that structure, right? I go to you as the lawyer.
And so
I was going to say, but that in the same way that there isn't a sheet of paper to define that clearly, there's also nothing that's stopping us from coming together and approaching a foundation and saying, you're giving us this lump sum. There's nothing stopping us from going that way,
100%.
right? You know, we've seen the power of coalition building over the last year and how we've been able to knock down those doors. And as Melody said, those opportunities all of a sudden were possible in the last 16 months. What made it possible? The fear of these coalitions coming down and knocking those doors down.
And the platform has to be about racial and social justice.
It has to be.
It's racial and social justice and
Absolutely.
equity.
And in the philanthropy sector, I think we need to also challenge, we're still dealing with an antiquated form of giving. They get their tax write-off. They're still at less than 5% in some cases.
Exactly.
These are private closed dollars. And I think at the moment that they become, they get their tax write-off, they should become more of a public sort of, access. And we need to partner with, community-based foundations. This is some of the work that we've been doing currently, is saying, how do we have these conversations at a moment of, racial reckoning, and we're calling this out. This is the moment to do it. And I think that we're slowly seeing boards and trustees have this understanding. So we really need to continue to engage. And that word that you said, coalition building, this has to be just how we did the survey on the national level. We have to do the same thing with these larger philanthropic organizations. And I think that, one example I'll give, we love grants for the arts, but who knows what happens behind the grants for the arts whenever they meet every year after year. Let's start opening those conversations. We're not part of that. And these are the folks that are making decisions. And yes, they need their conference, but this is what we need to be doing more of, is understanding how we build coalition and pushing those folks that have taken the write-off, that have taken the benefit from the policies in place, and continue to challenge that. I really do think so.
I actually believe that that what's being said here is exactly what needs to be done. And I was very happy to hear the call to action. Thank you so much. That we have been talking, and we have the data, and now it's time to act. There is, I don't tend to mince words about what's happening here, and I'm not going to call this a COVID problem. We are in a major culture war in this country. It's actually global, but let's just focus with the United States. Our existence, your existence, your institution's existence, our cultural arts institutions' existence, our cultural warriors' existence is we now have to be on the front line. I used to tell people, try not to use war analogies. I'm sorry, we're now at war. We're at war. And I hate, did you hear that 91%?
Nikisha?
Did you hear that 91%? How would you equate a battle where 91% of your troops are at risk of dying?
Yeah.
Is that a win? Is that a neutral or is that a loss? Get real, folks. They're not playing with us. They have come out against even speaking about racism in the school, even speaking about history, even speaking against racism. And here we are. We want to have platforms where we're exposing this and we're exposing that. We want to do it to the arts. We want to do it. We want to do it every which way we can, in every creative way we can. And you think they're going to fund us?
And what does that mean for our communities?
Thank you.
It's I call it.
I am not saying that we shouldn't pitch, have a real plan. You could call it a battle plan. Remember, we are voices from the battlefield. You can call it whatever. But you have to have, not you, we have to have a plan. We have to be really tight with each other. You can't have 3 women standing on 138th Street by ourselves. And that's a reference to Martha, Louis Como and me. A coalition at a demo and everybody backed out. They didn't bother to tell us. We're there, the three, we will never say die. Well, look who's still standing, okay? Anyway, we need to have a plan. And this
Esmeralda, you're giving me heart palpitations.
This data is powerful ammunition.
Yeah.
It is powerful ammunition for advocacy. Those of you who can't lobby, educate. Those of you who can't educate, visit an office. Make a phone call. But you have to have a real strong backbone, and you really have to understand that you have nothing to lose. Did you hear 91%?
Right. That part right there.
You have nothing to lose. They are planning our this extinction right now. They're already planning how they're going to use that firehouse.
Yeah.
They're planning it.
Yeah.
So yes, I absolutely say I agree that it has to be on all 3 governmental fronts. But there is another front, and we talked about it earlier on. I'm raising it again. We have to understand that we have to organize our community to be our real invisible base.
Organization is key. Organization are the things that
organization is a life and death month. We either organize with our community or we die.
And those are the panels that Dudley and I were working on, yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. I know. This is not a new battle. It's the same battle that we've been waging for over 400 years, folks. It's the same battle. We're just looking at it from the front of cultural arts institutions. But believe me when I say they have to get rid of our institution in order to have totalitarian speak in this country. They can't have us talking about another reality, another viewpoint. They can't have performers doing it. They can't have artists doing it. They can't have poets doing it. They can't have us. We can't dance it. We can't sing it. We can't play it. We're not supposed to be we're supposed to be silenced. And they're doing it with the money. But we can change that. But in the end, the only one that can save us is our community in the end.
I think
all of this is temporary.
Yeah.
Because the enemy is not going to fund you forever.
It is coming together. Oh, sorry, Nikisha, go ahead.
No, I was saying that what I call it is cultural colonization, the ways in which we eliminate, displace, design our arts and making sure that we have a limited amount of resources. It emulates various other types of forms of oppression. And I think that, yes, we have to push the community to support us, because people just think of voting and civic education as a form of just like, we're just going to vote for whoever aligns with our values, or we may have a limited amount of information on a certain candidate or something like that. The power of votes and the power of community investment, meaning when we're investing into a candidate or something like that, that weighs heavy. And I don't think our community understands the power of not just our vote, but our how much we do control the purse strings, because like we said earlier, those are our tax dollars. And our community has experienced marginalization and oppression to make sure that America's coffers are in the trillions. And so the fact that we are not, we have, just as much as we're fighting for arts and culture, right, and making sure that we have policies in place and making sure that resources come down to us, we have to think about ourselves through, and I'm going to always be pushing policy. We have to think about us sitting at the table when they're talking about housing. When they're talking about housing and development, like we should be a part of whatever discussion HUD is having a discussion on, or whatever our local housing development folks are having discussion on, just as much as we need to be a part of the table when we're talking about violence interruption and policing in our communities, or food insecurity, or just any type of mobility policies, because that's the way that we're able to make sure that we are ingrained in every aspect, because we already are ingrained. It's just that we're kept out, and we have to make sure that we are ingrained in all parts. And that's where coalition building comes into play, because if we have a coalition that's pushing on that level, making sure that we're educating the community, and then we have an aspect of our coalition that is thinking about how can, and I remember Amy, we spoke about this, the farmers bill. How can our culture have a farmers bill themselves? Where is our $1 billion that's being injected into our communities specifically, and into our organization specifically? And on top of that, the reason why it has to be on all levels, because we can get screwed on the state level, because the state can say, I'm going to appropriate this money to organizations that are marginalized in upstate New York, for example, versus in South Bronx. So the state has that jurisdiction, and then the local has that jurisdiction. So where our hands are tied in every aspect. So it's building that coalition and continuing to collect the data, because we have
Nakisha, I don't think anybody is in disagreement with you about the policy, the need to do policy work. But let me point out what our survey said. Our survey says that these organizations don't have staff, that these organizations can barely keep what they have, that they rent, and they're not going to be able to pay the rent. So the real question I'm putting on the table is, we're all going to be, some of us are starving, some of us are already in going through malnutrition as institutions. All of what Nakisha's saying has to be done. Who is going to do it?
That part.
Are we going to direct some of our energy toward advocacy away from or with our programs, and put advocacy and organizing up there with programmatic presentations, with administration, with grant writing? We have to have time to do this. We have to dedicate the time to do this.
And also,
the investment
I am
investment.
endorsing everything that Nakisha just said.
Right.
Yeah.
And how do we pull the resource? And how do we pull the resources we do have to shore up one another? Real talk, because those of us who don't have space, there are those of us who have more than one space. How do we support those who don't have a space? How do we support,
It's important for us to really consider, and we've talked about this time and again. I mean, 25 years of cultural equity group work. Do we really put our money where our mouths are? Do we invest as 50, 100 organizations in a lobbyist who will work on behalf of the field? Because we always come to knocking on doors, and I call it the dog and pony show at City Hall and the state around budget time. Everybody's doing that at budget time. Who's cultivating now it's a whole new city council at the city this year. New mayor,
That's right.
new city council. I don't care that they look like us. Quite honestly, I don't care
It's our
what
money.
the council looks like. Because
Everybody's different.
because if they don't know us, what does it matter that they look like us? The thing is to be able to educate them about the work that we're doing, that our art is not art for art's sake. That when we're talking racial and social justice, I don't want arts money. I want money from every damn pot of money that exists at the city level. So that there's a way, there's an approach of being able to, right now with all of this, the federal recovery money that came in, all the money that came into the state, NISCA, the New York State Council on the Arts, saw an increase. That was it. Our organizations don't see money from NISCA. We get $49,000 in general operating money from the State Council on the Arts. You kidding me? In the meantime, a shitload of money went into the state for Save Our State, what is it? The small business grants that included for-profit arts organizations as potential applicants, but did not include the not-for-profit organizations as businesses, as small businesses. And that should have been an opportunity for us. I mean, we did a whole rally and demonstration trying to get that language included in their guidelines. It dropped, but we tried, right? And that's because we got word of it last minute. So if there was someone that kind of has their finger on the pulse of all this stuff that's happening, mobilizing us will mobilize. But it always be too late. It's always at the end of the game.
That's what I was just going to say. Just to add to what you're saying, Melody, we cannot, yes, we're in crisis mode, but we cannot approach this like we're in crisis mode. Right. We've got to look at this as the sustainable plan here.
Thank you.
How do we do this over time?
This has to be part of our budget when we talk about capacity. We have to say we're going to include a certain amount of money to assure that we have a lobbyist that's going to work with us and be that advocate. And lobbyist, not an advocate. I can advocate a lobbyist. I don't need an advocate.
I hear something.
I don't need other folks to make believe they're advocating on my behalf.
But I hear something more than just lobbyists. Yeah. What I hear Nada and Esmeralda talking about is devoting money to organize with our community. That
Thank you.
Pressure is going to come from the people in our communities. I mean, if they get us strung out into, discipline-based arts organization, trying to be like other discipline-based arts organization, that's not us. We're of, by, and for our communities. And so any problem that comes up in the community, that's our responsibility too. It isn't just to make a play about it. It's to address the problem.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement, Dudley, because in our organizing panels, what we were trying to really speak to is that we are all a part of promoting a value shift against this individual competitive framework in which they've set us up, where we have to organize and be present for one another and learn together and push together for collaboration and mutuality. I mean, we have to really, echoing what Melody said, we cut across all sectors. And we saw how our grassroots organizations are truly essential. I mean, we promote social cohesion. We promote basic services, public good services where the government fails us. But, like Martha said at a lot of the closing panels, and I just want to plug the website, you can still see all of the different panels that are archived on the Creative Justice Initiative, is, to make sure that we're there together working and creating our solutions, like Dudley said, from the bottom up. I mean, it's a real value shift. And Martha always was saying at the end of our panels, it's not like I go to college and get a job being an activist. It's our civic duty. It's our civic duty. The same way that we
communities that we come from
and be educated, we have to, really learn from that ancestral DNA that we are so proud from, and to build these villages so that we are stronger together and we can't come down. Or like they say in climate justice, right? We need strong roots to weather the storm.
Absolutely.
Beautifully put.
What I'd like to do is turn it to Annie so that we can address at least 2 questions from the broader audience, and then we'll conclude.
So we have 2 questions that I think, I think that we've answered some of it, but I think if we can answer more direct, like next action is like, Can we provide a list of orgs that have filled the survey? Is that data available to share with our audience and or on the website? I think it would be really helpful to understand, the composition and just understanding more of the regional data. That I think that would be great. And what the second question is, what are the best ways to address these funding losses? Well, I think we've given a whole list of, we've got to address the policy, we've got to address philanthropic dollars and investment and their patterns of funding. I also want to just kind of raise that there are initiatives that we also know of that we can learn from and continue to build coalition, like the intercultural advocacy. I think that it's put together by NALAC. Is it now SIP Culture is part of it? There's like 3 other organizations, but those are the 2 that are popping up. Alternate Roots, yes. So I think reaching out and doing that coalition work is going to be really important in this next phase. And so I would also add a plug there that an action is for funders to really invest in that coalition building, because it is a learning space. As you said, we don't go to school to be activists. We learn it through the trenches. I mean, that was me last week at 1 a.m. at City Hall advocating for our budget. Like, we have to be able to bring younger voices along the process and teach them and give them the access. That is our role. And I want to just really raise, I mean, this is a really interesting question that, how this is a counterpoint to like the major media stories that really work, to raise the profile of funders. We saw the McKinsey Scott gifting, was it 286 million or anybody know? What was it?
Much more than that.
Billions. Okay, there you go. See, so how do we get this information to those that inform that process? And I think we all sat there and kind of thought about that, because we had sister like-minded organizations that made that list. So what made them sort of the ideal candidate for this when we're all in this together? So I think it's really about, I keep saying it's about sitting down and having those difficult conversations with Philanthropy that need to be had as well, because they're the ones informing.
Well, I think that going to Esmeralda's point, we need to start thinking about what our strategy is, what our framework is, and how one presents a strategy, right? That is inclusive of what's happening, not only at the local level, but at the national level for our communities. So that we need to break that structure of hierarchy, of colonial, like I pick you.
Exactly.
And then that means that the other one is not as good, right? Mm-hmm. And we can't fall into that. Exactly. We can't fall into that. We have to break that. And I think that the conversation that was had by that Melody and Amy moderated with that panel of how do we restructure systems, right? Or create new systems of how we should be looked at, how we should be funded, and what our activist process is going to be at the local level and at the national level. Because we can't be picked, right, apart. And that is always a strategy, to pick us apart. Kind of a strategy.
Yeah.
We can't fall into that. We have to fall into, like, we're on the scene, we have done the work, and we know the work. And what this data tells us is that you all are falling short, not us. We're not falling short.
We gotta form our line and hold it.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah, absolutely. So what I'd like to say is that this is not the end of our discussion. The next round is formulating all of the recommendations that came out today, that have come out of the series of panels. And we are presenting and we are creating in unison a brown paper that will have all of the strategies that we will be going forward with. As we have done in this series, it's been a collaborative series, so everyone is welcome to join us in the process, because one of the things that we have to be very clear about is that these institutions are for our children, are for the future. It's not for us, we're doing it, but what do we leave our children? And what do we leave our children when people are saying that our legacy is going to be erased? We haven't allowed it to be erased, And this battle is about not erasing us or making us invisible. So that this panel is about discussing not allowing yourselves to be rendered invisible and making the choice of not being invisible. And everyone that has been part of this discussion has made that choice. So I say to our broader audience, you know, you have to make the choice as well. Because if we don't, we will be erased.
And join us.
And what we're seeing absolutely is that the legal process, and we need to come back to talk about this, Esmeralda, that the laws that are going across the country to stifle vote, to stifle the truth being told in our schools, and make it legal, right? And that your panel was, when the law is not the law, we need to revisit that discussion, because
It's
now
gotten
things are
worse,
being
folks.
made.
It's gotten worse.
It's gotten worse. Look at the
Instead.
Supreme Court decision, right? And so that we need to be talking at a real level and not at the discussion that we had like 20 or 25 years ago. We were in a different moment, a heightened moment of white supremacy.
And we're not
to be
talking,
clear.
and we're definitely not talking in hypotheticals. Like,
no,
this is
real
reality.
Real time.
And I think one of the most important things is that to stress is that in order for us to own our discourse and continue to own our discourse, even if it's an annual collection of data or continuing to collect data as much as possible on what we do, just like how if the American Arts, when they send out their survey and they ask you to do that report every year, that's something that we have to get systematic, because this system is out to get us. And so we don't have the amount of we don't have the data that's necessary in order to drive our advocacy, to drive our lobbying efforts, and to point to numbers that say this is how we support our community. So I will recommend like organizations in general to make sure that you're documenting how, as much as possible, organizations that you interact with in your neighborhood, small businesses. How do you impact the local economy in your community? How do you impact the local mental health of the community members? Like, how do you, like, we have to continue to make sure we have the metrics. And it's not just for us. Like Amy said, we cannot move like we're in a crisis. Like Melody said, we cannot move in the crisis. We have to think about longevity of our cultural organizations. And we have to think about archiving this sort of information so that in 20, 30 years, people can look back and say, I have data that has been archived that shows that we have, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 91% of our organizations were close to being closed. And now years later, hopefully, I hope, we are now, we have 100% of organizations that don't face that. It's a total reversal, but we have to track, because we know that we live in a society that loves to erase the tracks that we make. So how do we cement the work that we do? And that's part of the foundation build, the foundation that we already have built, is that how do we continue growing that from that foundation? And so like, even though we face survey fatigue, even though we're like, we don't like to tell people our business, it's my business. Who, like, why you want to know what about all the business and our money? We live where that's a part of our culture, is to be protective, because we've been exploited by our society many times. And so, whatever safety mechanisms, knowing that the data that you share with us stays within the group, is just the aggregate, understanding that your privacy is protected, because if we don't protect ourselves, if we protect our people, and then our privacy, everything else will be exploited from the outside. So I think
absolutely. I was going to go to that point because of the question that was asked. Yeah. Anything that we do, anything that we collect is private, and it's not available to others.
What I will say that while privacy is necessary and needed, that we should also give out information, but we don't identify. We don't identify the participants of the survey, and we don't give out information that makes it easy for someone else to figure out who's being talked about. But I will add one other thing. If you are a nonprofit you really don't have any right to privacy. So please don't think that that's real. Gave that up for 501c3.
So we'll have to rethink that. So first of all, I'd like to say,
The opportunity
Nikisha,
is
thank
to
you
like work
so.
together.
Nikisha, thank you so. Everyone who's on the panel, thank you so much for hanging with us all the way through this series and coming to the data, and now coming to the brown paper, which is the next step. And then we're have organized and we're all attached at the hip.
No, wait, hold up. We
For
can't
sure.
leave without saying thank you, Martha, for pushing
Yes,
for
thank
all
you
these
for
years
bringing us
over and over and over
together.
again. So
No,
thank
thank
you.
you.
Organizing has to start now, folks. Organizing has to start now. As we're doing the brown paper, we need to start organizing within each other, with each other and with our respective communities. We're not sitting on some ivory tower.
Yes, ma'am.
And do we organize another survey for this year?
Well,
We'll talk to Nikisha, so we'll have an offline conversation. You can't organize everything online now, you know, like me on that one.
When we were prepping for this call yesterday,
We're feeling very homey together.
Yes, we just don't want to let each other go.
when we were prepping for
Exactly.
the
We
call
love each other.
yesterday,
We love each other.
we were talking about the importance of building trust and the trust that gets built even in filling these surveys.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a big question about this board support on this survey. I really do. I don't know how we depend on our board of directors when most of us don't have those type of boards. And so I just wonder what the element of trust was in people completing the survey. So with that, I say, yes, we need another survey. We need to build the trust from the respondents and the partners that we work with, because this was just a drop in the bucket. 577, only 200 and change responded, which doesn't tell our story. It doesn't tell our story. This is just a drop in the bucket. So another survey is needed. So yeah, Nikisha and Marta and Yvonne, who I see is in the chat, we need another survey.
Real quick,
But it's
real
the
quick.
way that we're going to build the trust and get the information we need. I think someone put in
No,
the
it
chat.
has to absolutely be expanded. We're very clear on that, but we had to start somewhere.
No.
Yeah.
And Annie and Isis for putting it out, and it needs to be expanded and made more extensive, no question.
So
Absolutely.
all
more
I'm saying is that
accessible.
it has to happen because this doesn't tell the story, right? This is just the
Exactly.
beginning. So the
This
work
is the beginning.
Neva
But the
has a
drop in
hand
the
up.
book, it is making it very critical that our organizations are in crisis. So that
Well, also,
is a given. Go Neva.
I just want to jump in because the issue of the fragility and this precarity of their organizations, a lot of what happened too is that we did write the survey or geared to organizations, but what we learned across the way is that the independent cultural worker, a lot of these people that were part of the gig economy didn't really know how to fit in, so that the next iteration of the survey will be fashioned such that the independent contractor, like the independent producers, independent curators, can be more active in their completion of the survey. Because it was
Artists, just
That's a good
artists.
point. Yeah.
yeah, so it was really geared to organizations, but it does tell a story, you know, that, and the numbers came out. So this is just the beginning, and we're gonna build
What it
together.
does say is that the field is in crisis. And this is what this is the organizing point that we have to start with, because there was no data before this. So this is where we go and we build. So all, thank you so very much. We're connected at the hip, we're connected at the heart, and we will continue the work. So thank you all.
And whoever is closest to Miami needs to go get Olga out of jail.
Yeah. I'm telling you what happened. She said that 20 policemen went onto the plane when it landed in Miami. So she hasn't been able to connect. So we hope that everything is okay. We love her. What does she do? Huh? Love you.
She started to organize.
Bye. Bye.